I find this is a really important concept. The concept itself of networking, in my experience, exists everywhere around the world. What is different is what are the characteristics that make you feel connected to someone else. That depends on where you are in the world. So if I take the example of my home country, France, the main driver for networking is undergraduate study alumni association. So if I'm in France, I'm a graduate of the École Polytechnique de Paris, I will network with other graduates of that university. Whichever field they're in. They could be in journalism, they could be, it doesn't matter. We graduated from the same place, and that creates a very strong emotional bond there. That bond means nothing here, okay, because we use different criteria. If you're in Mexico, people will network by family. Now, what Mexicans call family is extended family here, but that's the connection. In Somalia, it's going to be the clan. In Japan, it will be the company you work for. You will be a Sony man or a Honda man. Okay, they don't talk about Sony women. But the idea is you're connected by the company. So how do most immigrants network in Canada?
To their friends.
Yeah. Most immigrants will network with people who come from the same country they come from. And what's the limitation of that? That's not the way people network in Canada, fundamentally. How do people network in Canada? What creates the tie between people in a networking event? Common. So yeah, you're on the right. So the way I look at it is this. If you go to a networking event, which question will people ask you initially? What do you do? What answer are they looking for? Fundamentally, the answer they're looking for is information so I can place you on this table. This table has two dimensions. One is the profession. You can be an engineer, you can be an accountant, you can be an HR professional, you can be a sales rep, you can be in marketing, communication, all these professions. Okay? The other dimension of that table is the sector. So sectors could be, you're in the technology sector, you're in the financial service sector, you're in the oil and gas industry, and so on. Each of these will be finely subdivided. So for example, within engineering, what are the subdivisions? So civil, electrical, mechanical, chemical, environmental. There's even coastal engineering. Anybody has ever heard of coastal engineering? Okay. I never heard of it until I met a guy from Burundi. Now, why somebody from Burundi studied coastal engineering since Burundi is landlocked was always something that bothered me, that puzzled me. But he studied coastal engineering in Vladivostok, in Russia, and then he immigrated to Canada and he landed in Toronto. Okay? Well, yeah, there is a lake, but it's still not the same. And I remember with him, we looked for the association that's related to his work. And we found there is a Canadian Association of Coastal Engineers. Yeah. Exactly. There's two chapters or two branches, one in Vancouver, one in Halifax. What does that tell him?
He's in the wrong place.
He's in the wrong place. Exactly. Okay? And what I told him is don't move yet. Okay? But look for a job and prepare everything so that the minute you get a job, you're moving. Because don't move, because if you move to Vancouver and you find a job in Halifax, you're going to have to move again. Okay? But be ready to move, because the odds of you finding a job where you are very low. In another workshop, somebody said that one of her clients was in the shipbuilding industry and landed in Edmonton. Okay, so I think it's very obvious, right? So, well, what would be subdivisions of accounting?
Tax, finance, audit.
Yeah, financial analysis, all nine yards. Okay, and within HR, well, you can be in recruitment, you can be pension and benefit, you can be payroll, whatever. Okay, The same will be true. It will be also finely subdivided vertically. So if you think of the technology sector, well, people will divide it between people who do software versus hardware. And within software, there will be people who do applications versus programming versus websites. On the hardware, you will have people who do devices like what used to be BlackBerry, but you have people who do elements that go into those things. So chips or whatever, transistors and so on. The financial industry. You have banks, insurance companies, mutual funds. And within banks, you will have people who do business, like corporate banking. You have investment banking. You'll have retail banking. In insurance, you have car insurance, life insurance, credit insurance, and so on. So all these things, and in oil and gas, you have upstream, midstream, downstream. And within upstream, you have conventional versus unconventional. And within unconventional, you have mining versus SAGD. I mean, it all is finely subdivided. And when people ask you, what do you do? What they really want to know is which line and which column are you on? Yeah. So if I take Caroline's example, first job in Canada was, I'm an HR business partner working in a graphic chip company. That gives you her line, her column. And this is what people want to know. Why do they want to know that? Well, if you're on the same line as me, what does it mean? We can talk shop. If we're on the same column, we can talk shop. If we're not on the same line and we're not on the same column, what happens? Have a nice life. The conversation will end very, very quickly because fundamentally, by Canadian standards, we are not connected. By other country standards, we might be, but people will not see that connection here. I presented at a conference. It was the Canadian Association of Insurance Auditors. So that gives you clearly their line and their column. Okay? Auditors in the insurance industry. That's the people you meet there. When I worked at Xerox, I was a chemical engineer specialized in the scale-up of high added value chemicals. That gives you my line and my column. Now, what is really important for your clients is one, determining which line and which column they're on, which is not always easy. And we come back to your point, using the words that people use to describe that work in Canada. So I'll give you an example where somebody was using the wrong word and it had a big impact. One of the people I worked with was from India, and he described himself as an architect. He had his degree said architecture. So he would network with other architects. He would go to events for architects. And people would tell him after a little while, you're not an architect. Then he applied for a license from the College of Architects, and they told him, you're not an architect. Okay. Why? Well, what happened was this. What he was designing was not buildings. He was designing subdivisions. Now, what word will Canadians use to describe that work? Urban planning.
Yeah.
Urban planning. So when he started to describe himself as an urban planner and network with urban planners instead of architects, he got a job as an urban planner, of course. Okay, it was in Toronto, so you got a job in New York region. Okay? But you see the idea. Okay, you have to use the word that people will use. So along the lines of, you can find it on the job postings for sure. Okay? But the key thing is you have to use the word that people use here. And it may not be the word that people use in other parts of the world. And using so that part, in my experience, is critical. And just like the coastal engineer example demonstrates, there is a professional association for everything in Canada. We have an amazing propensity to create professional associations. Yeah. So what it means is, as an immigrant, it is really important to identify which professional association is the most relevant to us. And then be active in that association. What does being active in an association mean?
Attend workshops.
Attend events. even better, help organize those events. Okay? Having your having your name in the directory of the association does absolutely nothing for you. You have to meet people. Why is that? What do you gain by being at those events?
Opportunities.
So I'll describe it as you gain information
Yes.
that can lead you to identify opportunities. Absolutely. Okay. So that's one big one.
You will learn trends in your industry.
You can learn trends in the industry. Absolutely. There's one other thing which is really critical. It's you learn how people think and communicate in your profession or in your industry. In other words, when they evaluate somebody's performance, qualifications, what do they consider important? What do they consider less important? I can tell you that is the way. So, as an engineer, I have an engineering degree, and I worked as an engineer in Canada. But the moment I really started to understand how Canadian engineers think was when I became active in the local, so in Ontario they call them chapters, of Professional Engineers of Ontario, equivalent of APEGA. Because why is that? Well, when people go to these meetings, first of all, we are among peers. Nobody reports to anybody else. And we can talk shop, obviously, and we can let our hair down, if I can put it that way. People will be less guarded. So they will make off-the-cuff remarks that will enable you to understand what they value and what they don't value. So I find it is really helpful to join these associations and be active. Now, most immigrants can probably join 10 to 15 associations. And if you do that, you will bankrupt yourself because all the fees will just, it won't work. So I encourage people to identify which association is the most targeted to them, most relevant. So if I take the example of this coastal engineer from Burundi, if he joins the PO or APEGA, what will happen when he goes to a meeting of those associations? He will meet tons of engineers, but the odds of him meeting another coastal engineer are very low. If he goes to a meeting of the Association of Coastal Engineers, who is he going to meet? Other coastal engineers. Now, the fact that there is no chapter in Toronto, as you said, tells him he's in the wrong place. But yeah, so this is what I mean by targeted. Like, I know in Calgary there's an association, for example, of SAGD engineer. You have something like 35 members. So it's not a big association. But if you are a part of it, you will really get the scoop about what's going on in your field. So now, these associations, if they're very small like this, very targeted, do not meet very often. So you probably want to supplement the activity in one of these associations with a bigger association like APEGA or CPA Alberta or something that will have more regular meetings. Because if you meet only once every 3 months, your job search is not moving all that fast. Make sense to everyone? Okay. But the idea is, if I network within my own ethnic community, what happens? The odds of me getting information that is useful in my job search are much lower. If I'm Chinese or Filipino or Indian, there's probably enough of a community that I can meet people. And maybe eventually I will meet one person who is in my field. But the problem is there's only a small number of people. For most people, you want to, I'm not saying you don't network with people from your own community, that's not the point. But you do not limit your socialization to that. Because if you do, that is really career suicide in a Canadian context. It will limit your opportunities tremendously. Questions or comments on this one? This is a big deal in my experience. Onai, did you? Yeah, okay, let me give you this.
This might just be the clients I deal with. They have a very easy time identifying the row they're on. They often struggle identifying what industry they were in or what industry they want to go into.
Yeah.
I'm not. Maybe it's because they want to transition career, but To your point, any suggestion around helping them find the industry?
So, yeah, this is a bit of a challenge. There are some industries where it's really hard to get into unless you were in right from the start.
Yeah.
Healthcare comes to mind. It is really hard to become an accountant in hospitals, for example, or anything in the healthcare system, unless you kind of grow up in that system. Because it's such a different way of thinking that it's like you want. So the best way of doing it, if you want to get into an industry that tends to be fairly restrictive, or like, you know, it's like there's very little exchange between that industry and others, then you will need to rub shoulders with people from the industry. Okay? I mean, if I take my own example, I'm not an accountant, but I've worked so much with accountants that some people thought I worked for the firms. Yeah. And the way I did it was really by listening to what they were saying, using examples from their context. And after a while, they thought, oh, you must be an accountant. Okay? Another sector like this would be the police. Okay, like the police has an entirely, the recruitment system to become a police officer is very specific. It's much more complex than the typical recruitment system for general positions. So unless you know people inside, it's going to be very hard for you to understand their system.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you're trying to get into an industry that is relatively isolated from the rest, you will have to get to know people inside. And that's where becoming a member of these, like going to the meetings of the associations at least, maybe not becoming a member, you may not be able to become a member if you're not there, but being there, listening to what people say, that will help a lot. Make sense to everybody? Okay. This is a big deal, really big deal in my experience, because, and this is, we come back to that, you know, some people will say, well, network with everybody. Sounds great, but it's very challenging. On the other hand, if you network with people in your field, that becomes much easier, because now you have two things to discuss with them. And it really does make a big difference. I'll give you an example. So as a chemical engineer, like in the late 90s, there were a couple of events, or there were one event which happened several times, if I can put it that way, that had a huge impact on chemical engineering. It was the merger of those big companies like Exxon and Mobil, or which one? British Petroleum and Amoco, or Total, Elf, and Fina, all merged into one company. So what was the consequence of that? Well, for example, let's take Exxon Mobil. Exxon had 5,000 chemical engineers at the time. Mobil would have had, let's say, 4,000. Exxon Mobil ended up with 6,000 chemical engineers. If you do the math, what does it mean? 3,000 lost their job. So, and this happened several times. And guess what happened when I attended conferences, chemical engineering conferences around that period of time? The only thing, well, not the only thing, but the one thing that we would discuss almost invariably, you know, when we got together for dinner or meal or whatever, was these mergers. And if you showed up at one of these meetings and you said, what mergers? How do you think people reacted?
Probably I will do.
Exactly. If you don't know about these events that are having such a big impact on us, what conclusion will people reach? You're not one of us. Exactly. They will not think you come from another part of the world. They will think you're not a chemical engineer. Okay? So knowing what's going on in the industry is also part of what you learn by going to these events. Okay? All right, we'll skip this one. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit. So what are the challenges that immigrants experience? Well, one is determining who they should network with. So we've talked a little bit about that. Again, connecting with people. So So how can immigrants find people to network with? Yes, LinkedIn is a very obvious one. So, learning how to approach people through LinkedIn is an important skill, in my experience. Because I can tell you, as I receive LinkedIn invitations all the time, and some are way better than others. And like some people is you just get an invitation, no nothing. Okay? Others, they send you a whole paragraph, and I remember one lady from Qatar, she sent me it was a fabulous introduction. It was like a whole paragraph, and then I responded, and it's like she sent me more, and she had fantastic soft skills. Okay? I went to meet with her because I thought it was going to be so interesting. Okay? So the idea is like how you approach people is, well, you demonstrate your soft skills again. Okay? Where else can immigrants find events? Absolutely. So particularly those in their field. What else? So these, right? Kayak. ERIC is the equivalent in Edmonton. I can't even remember what that acronym stands for. Somebody told me I should add it, but I can't remember what it stands for. So I apologize. What else? There's one other area. Remember I talked about trade magazines. If you go to trade magazines, so where do you find trade magazines? Which libraries? Because you won't find them in all libraries. Yes, you have to go to the main reference library, the big one downtown. If you go to a branch library, they won't have it. The other place you can go to is universities and colleges. So for example, if I take my situation, I would go to the Faculty of Engineering of the University of Calgary. They will have those magazines. You will not be able to borrow them, but you can read them there. And you can ask to make photocopies as well. Now, what are we looking for when we look at these trade magazines? One is news about what's going on in the sector or the industry. The other thing we're looking for, if you read the articles will invariably end with a byline, as they call it. What's a byline?
The name of the author of the article.
Exactly. It will say, Joe Smith wrote this article, kind of thing. It doesn't say it in those words, but essentially, it will tell you who wrote the article, where they work, and very often you will have their email address. What I encourage people to do is this. Read the article, number one. Identify things that you found interesting in the article. You have to be genuine. Find something that you really think is good about the article. And then find questions that you want to ask about the article. So not too many, okay, like maximum 3. And then you write an email to that person saying, I read your article in such and such magazine. I really liked when you talked about this. Here's what I like, kind of thing. I have questions for you about your article. Here are my questions. The odds of you getting a response are pretty good if you do it this way. Now, you won't get a response all the time. But the odds of you getting a response are way higher than just, trying to reach somebody at random, through LinkedIn, just like that. Okay? Because it always comes back to, if you've made the effort up front, people will be willing to help. Yeah. If you don't make the effort, they won't make the effort. It's that simple. So trade magazines I found are really helpful to connect with people. I have started conversations with Globe and Mail journalists that way. I read their article, I have a question, I tell them, and you get a response. I wouldn't dream of getting a response in France, okay, in that way. So, professional associations, very important, and events of these associations for sure, right? All right, questions or comments on what we've discussed today? Yes?
In the professional association's website, they have links.
Go right ahead.
In some of the association's websites, they have links of resources.
Yes.
Links of different organization per provinces that could help some of the newcomers or some of the job seekers.
Very true.
too.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh yeah, I mean, there is a wealth of information. The challenge is finding where exactly, and that's when talking to people who kind of guide you makes a world of difference.